There are a lot of other things which we can talk about, but they will come. If not today, in the coming days, inshallah, we'll spend some time on these arguments. So the cosmological argument presupposes certain thing. It starts from what exists, the world. The world is the totality of what exists. Let's see. Now, this cosmological argument makes a lot of presuppositions. Obviously, those presuppositions are not proven, and most of the time they say there's no need to prove them because they are self-evident. And self-evidence, if there is something is self-evident, then you don't need to prove it. Muslim logicians would say tahsil hasil. That's trying to achieve something which is already accomplished. But just to look ahead, for example, how can you problematize this sort of thinking? Self-evidence is always relative to your milieu, your education, your socialization. So self-evident for one group might not be self-evident for other group. It's not a form of relativism. It's not just stating the fact. And you'll see in Tahafatul Philosopher, Imam Ghazali, he makes use of this sort of thinking and problematizes philosophers, Muslim philosophers, the disciples of Greek philosophers in the Muslim world. Against them, he makes this argument that what you call self-evident is not self-evident. Otherwise, all rational people would have agreed on that. And since we don't agree on them, it can't be self-evident. Anyway, so cosmological argument depends on a lot of presuppositions. The first presupposition, which I guess is treated as something self-evident, is that the world exists. And as we know from the modern philosophy and even ancient philosophy, you can't treat it as a self-evident truth. At least in abstraction, you can problematize the existence of the world, doubt and all those things, and Descartes and all those things. You don't have to actually believe that world doesn't exist, but you can still say that you can't prove that world exists. So on the analytical level, for example, so the world exists. That's the first presupposition, and the second presupposition is that this world cannot exist on its own. So the first presupposition is that world exists, and this one is easier because probably more people would be inclined to believe that. And world exists, and it doesn't exist, or it can't exist by itself, because then it would have to come from nothing to something without a cause, which is something impossible. And this is treated as self-evident as well, I guess, or proven by experience. Obviously, you can object to that as well, because something is our experience, but nothing is beyond experience. So how can we project the laws of something to nothing, for example? Okay. The way we are going, I think we are going to have to spend a lot of time on this one, a lot of sessions. We'll see. So that's the setting. There's nothing to something. So it doesn't, cannot come into existence on its own. But there's another presupposition as well, that the world cannot be eternal. Now, there might be physical reasons to believe that world cannot be eternal, for example. The arguments from physics. But on the basis of logic, to say that world cannot exist from eternity, because if you can believe that, and a lot of people did believe it, or even do believe it even today, if world exists from eternity, not in this form, but in some form, then it means you don't need any cause for it to come into being. But those who argue for cosmological argument, they believe that it's unthinkable, it's impossible. Now, impossibility, when they talk about it, it can be physical impossibility, so that would have to leave to physicists. And I'm not sure whether there is any sort of consensus, but Imam Ghazali has made some sort of argument in Tahafa regarding that. but obviously he didn't have any knowledge of the physics of today. So physical impossibility, logical impossibility. I think logical impossibility, I'm not sure how it can be logically impossible. To say that world has existed, because it doesn't seem to involve any contradiction as far as I can see. But I think what they mean by logical impossibility is it is unthinkable, impossible to think. So a lot of logic, at least logic before Frege and all this, is mixed with psychology as well. And people think that because it is unthinkable for us, impossible to think or imagine that world, that means it is logically impossible. But that's not true. Unthinkability and unimaginability is something contingent, contingent to our education, sort of minds we have, that should be differentiated from logical impossibility. At least that's one of the arguments. Okay, so these sort of any cosmological argument has to presuppose these things. At least we have it has to presuppose that world exists. It has to presuppose that it came into being, so it wasn't there at some point. And it has to presuppose that world cannot exist eternally. And all related presupposition on either it has to presuppose that self-evidently, or has to provide arguments to prove these presuppositions. So we haven't even started on cosmological arguments, but I think that's a good point to stop here. We'll just go back to